I've recently gotten a lot more interested in reading books, believe it or not. There was a lot when I was growing up that involved TVs, movies, and video games. I was born in 1995, and so kind of the golden age of video games. I can think of about a billion hours playing Call of Duty with my friends, for example, or whatever else. MMORPGs sucked me into World of Warcraft, RuneScape, it doesn't matter. I was addicted. And so as I got a little bit older and finally came to realize that none of that was actually worth my time en masse, because I still dabble from time to time, but playing 8 or 10 hours a day, probably not very useful. That was the conclusion, of course. And so I started reading a little bit more, and I got involved in what is colloquially being known as the self-help movement, though I think that carries a connotation that's a little unfortunate, because it strikes me as like this negative kind of almost cringy thing when it's really not. You know, it's kind of supposed to be this community that a lot of us lack these days, where we all try to help each other in some way, shape, or form, keep each other accountable. And so I found people like Ryan Holiday, I found Jordan Peterson, and I found whoever else, you name it, Joe Rogan. You know, recently it's Andrew Huberman. He's been huge. All sorts of folks. To other comedians, Theo Vaughn, you name it. Whoever could give me a unique perspective about their experience, I was interested in learning about. And so naturally, you get on this route of Stoicism. You get on this route of, you know, old philosophers and psychology, and you find all these different things and these ideas that are hundreds, thousands of years old. And you go, all these people have had these problems that I'm wrestling with right now, and yet I have it about 1,000 times better than any of them. But I still seem to be complaining in the same ways. And I couldn't figure out why. And honestly, I still can't figure out why. But I'm trying to learn a little bit more each day. And so to that end, I'm reading more, like I said. At least I'm trying to. And so I recently read a really famous novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And that name gets thrown around a lot. And I think it's thrown around a lot because it's recently become popular from people like Lex Friedman and Jordan Peterson, who have read in depth. Lex, who's read in the actual Russian, which I'm sure is much better than reading it in the English translation. But Richard Pavir and Larissa Volokonsky, probably butchering that, do a really good job, in my opinion, because the language is still beautiful. And the goal of this is kind of to share some of the things that I learned and some of the passages that I found really interesting or just beautifully, poetically written. But the hope is to either turn people onto the book, get them interested in reading like I needed. You know, I needed a push. And I feel like there weren't a lot of people who understood my perspective when I was first kind of starting out and collecting books, as I'm doing now, much more than I currently have the ability to read. But there are a lot of great things out there, and we have more access than ever. Whatever you might feel about Amazon, we have more access than ever. And I think it's important that we start sharing ideas with each other on a broad scale, and not in a guru sort of way, but in an authentic way. This is what I read. This is what I think about it. What do you think about it? Do we agree? Do we disagree? Where can we find common ground? And where can I change my mind? Because that's something I'm interested in as well. I think we get into this habit of putting up this worldview that we've held since we were like 10 years old. And we think that that's the way things should be. And then we just ascribe those beliefs to other people. And we get upset and we project our beliefs onto those people. The reason they're acting that way is because they're stupid, or the reason they cut me off is because they're a bad person, etc. We've all heard this 1,000 times. But it really is true. It's all this projection. It's the things that we see in ourselves that we're too afraid to come to terms with, the things that kind of brood in our subconscious. And Notes from Underground, which is, I think, an excellent introduction, given the length. It's only 131 pages, roughly, in this translation, in this copy. You can get it from anywhere, by the way, Barnes & Noble. It was written in the 1800s, so it's been around quite a long time. Dostoevsky actually lived from 1821 to 1881, which is a little remarkable that a book like this has stood the test of time. But the language is amazing. I remember listening to an interview with Jordan Peterson, and he said Dostoevsky ruined literature for him. And I can see why. There aren't a lot of people that write like this, if any, nowadays. And I'd have to imagine that the Russian language has something to do with that. But I just wanted to share a few things. I have some notes, and I've got passages that I kind of highlighted as I was reading when I first started this in the airport a few weeks ago. And I'm just now finally finishing today. But first, I'll start with the third chapter. I also like how Dostoevsky does chapters. It's not just like a straight up page. Sometimes they fall in the middle. Sometimes it's a clean break, but other times it's kind of just, oh, there's chapter 6. Anyways. So this whole section here in the description of himself as the underground man, I think is one of the most poetic sections from this book. And it goes like this. There, in its loathsome, stinking underground, our offended, beaten down, and derided mouse at once immerses itself in cold, venomous, and above all, everlasting spite. For 40 years on end, it will recall its offense to the last, most shameful details, each time adding even more shameful details of its own, spitefully taunting and chafing itself with its fantasies. It will be ashamed of its fantasies, but all the same, it will recall everything, go over everything, heap all sorts of figments on itself under the pretext that they too could have happened, and forgive nothing. It may even begin to take revenge, but somehow in snatches, with piddling things from beyond the stove, incognito, believing neither in its right to revenge itself, nor in the success of its vengeance, and knowing beforehand that it will suffer 100 times more from all its attempts at revenge than will the object of its vengeance, who will perhaps not even scratch at the bite. And that's unbelievable. He's written more in just a few sentences than many could write in an entire novel about the human condition. And he's writing this at a time when the atrocities of the 20th century in the eventual Soviet Union were coming to fruition in the background. And he prophetically is describing the type of person that the underground man in this novel represents. A person who hides in a basement and broods and thinks themselves to be more intelligent than everyone around them, yet knowing, has the self-awareness to know that they're just mousing around, biting at people, with full awareness that what they're doing is only toxic to themselves, but they can't help themselves. Their narcissism knows no bounds. And I think that's really incredible. I think there are a lot of parallels to today, and a lot of parallels within ourselves, in kind of the Jungian sense. And Jung is someone I'm just now kind of diving into as well, because his work is so dense, it's so hard to get through, that I have to do little chunks. But that's on the 11th page of the book. 11. It's unbelievable. And it goes on. Here from page 17. For in order to begin to act, one must first be completely at ease, so that no more doubts remain. And that's that paralysis of action we all face. We all think that the situation needs to be absolutely perfect for us to actually finally take up action and do something, instead of realizing that it's never going to be perfect. So the perfect time to act will be something you're talking about at 88 on your deathbed and full of regret. And all it would have taken is looking a bit foolish and trying things that you've never tried before in order to follow some kind of dream. Even if it fails, at least you knew you did it, right? And here on page 18, wickedness could, of course, overcome everything, all my doubts, and thus could serve quite successfully in place of a primary cause, precisely in that it is not a cause. Again, just this narcissistic, self-indulgent, perfectly written language about somebody, a hypothetical somebody, this underground man, who's just so enthralled with his own thoughts that he projects his inadequacies onto everyone around him. And if he would just open up and actually have a conversation or a heart-to-heart with somebody and reveal himself to people, he would find that they're not so scary and evil. It's so interesting. And there are just so many, almost every page after that, that I won't necessarily go into here in this somewhat rambly video. But this, to a certain extent, is kind of an effort to document my progress as well, and just see if there's anything I learned. Maybe look back at these 10 years from now and think, hey, maybe you did grow. Maybe you did actually learn something. And it goes on. Let's go back to some of the notes that I actually wrote. They'll be better than my random stream of consciousness. I wrote down from page 22. That page in general is an interesting take on a man who speaks of all the things that should be done and all the ways people should behave, only to go against and contradict himself 30 minutes later. It's as if this instance is of a man bargaining with the most base portions of himself, as if pleading what he wishes to be to another person will make it so, yet only to once again revert back to who he is actually. And that's an interesting thing, and I've found myself doing that, and I've caught people doing that. We probably all have, if we were being honest with ourselves, is you kind of devise this plan for yourself, how you're going to make yourself better, and then you want to go tell somebody as if that's going to actually make it happen. Like, I'm really going to get in shape this year. Let me go tell Kevin. And Kevin's like, nah, he's not going to do that. And then 2 days later, you've gone to the gym once and you go, I think we're good. And the cycle continues. And then pages 30 and 31. This is the unbelievable summation of human nature in 2 short pages. I wrote, it's really unbelievable. Why does it feel like a deep truth, like something I've known all along but was required to read before I could unlock it? What is it about our banal or base nature that encourages us to misbehave just so we can prove to ourselves that we're in control? And yet, therein lies the juxtaposition. If it's all arithmetic, then as Dostoevsky suggests, even the misbehavior is out of our control. It's easy to see why nihilism had such a foothold in the godless Russian 19th century existence. Pretty harsh criticism. I must have been a bit tired there before my flight. And this is about the 9th chapter of the first part. And this novel, because I didn't mention it, is in 2 parts. And the first part is him reminiscing about his experiences as an old man, essentially. And the second part is actually, it's like Star Wars. He begins with the end and then goes in the second part to the beginning, where it all kind of began, where he started to become more of the slimy individual that he eventually became. In the 9th chapter, in the first part, this is what I wrote. A tale as old as time. The pursuit is actually the achievement. The pursuit is the reward. Our fear of needing to know what comes next, what the why is before we've even completed X, is what keeps us at a standstill. We know at depth that we don't really want what we claim we want, because we couldn't be certain what comes next. So why commit? It's better to never commit than have missed out on opportunities that we had to place aside. And then I wrote, right? And so it's basically us just saying, I'll get to that tomorrow. And I have this big idea, right? I'm going to do this big thing. I'm going to launch this product. I'm going to do this job. I'm going to get this promotion. I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to lose 10 pounds and, I'm going to read 10 books, whatever it is. And then we just let that keep going. We just have this dream that just sits out there in the ether. And I don't think it's necessarily a fear that we can't do it. I think it might actually be a fear that we might do it, and then we might have to find something else to do. Isn't that interesting? But in the second part, I didn't necessarily write as much down. You kind of know where things are going, since it's going back in time. But it's a pretty nasty portion, the second part, because he shows even more so how low he can stoop. And I won't ruin it. The goal of this is not to ruin the book. The hope is that somebody else will go out and read it and point out things that I didn't catch, because I'm sure there are a lot of those. Or to reflect on some of the things that I feel like I took away, and maybe somebody had a different perspective. But from the first chapter of the second part, this is kind of what I wrote about that. I wrote, this is such an interesting reflection on his cowardice and general brooding, wasting over a year of his life plotting to get back at someone who doesn't even know he exists. His cowardice is boundless, all talk and no follow through. And this is about a military officer in the story that would constantly just ignore him, and they would pass in the street, and he got offended by this and spent an entire year planning to get back at this guy who didn't even know he existed. And when he finally had the courage to bump into the guy to prove that he wasn't a coward, he just further proved that he wasted an entire year of his life because the guy didn't even notice. Anyways, when you read the book, it'll make sense, and it's pretty funny. That's another thing, Dostoevsky, he's so funny, the way he writes. It's so poetic, so eloquent, and it's so beautifully written, but at the same time, it's so funny without, I don't know if it's without trying to be, because if he was trying, it looks so effortless that it just looks like the way he writes. But anyways, it's beautiful. And then I skipped the second chapter apparently, and here's the third. Some thoughts on that. And I wrote at the top, fear is the theme. So I said, it's interesting how well he describes the paranoid and neurotic mind, how eloquently he showcases the internal dialogue of someone who's constantly at war with their own thoughts, and as a consequence, themselves and others. What a horrifying way to live. One, I'm ashamed to admit, is all too familiar to me. Delusions of grandeur, yet being cowardly. Standoffish, yet longing for connection. And there have been parts in my life that I can say that that kind of fits, unfortunately. I'd like to think that that's not the case now, but I think a less mature me would admit to that fact. And then finally, this is page 112, so quite a bit away from that one. And this is from the 8th chapter. And this is the underground man going on a tirade, like he does many times throughout the novel. And I said, in the middle of his tirade, it's interesting to see the way Dostoevsky perfectly describes the underground man's self-loathing and his shame at having feelings, which is so interesting. He spent so much time as a coward, of which he's fully aware, and continues to justify his cowardice as a response to the actions of those around him rather than as a result of his own insufficiencies and sloth. And yet he still shows he's capable of love, if only as a means to appear desirable momentarily, and then reclaim his power by throwing Lisa aside, when in reality he's just too immature to show himself truly to anyone for fear of being mocked. And isn't that interesting? Isn't that something we all suffer from? There's this fear of being able to put ourselves out there, fear of connecting, because someone might make fun of us or call us stupid. It's a tough thing to get over. I don't know if we ever will, but we keep trying, I suppose. And that's kind of another part of this. I feel like I think a lot of people talk about this crisis of meaning nowadays, which I think is definitely true. I think we're all striving for something and we don't know why. And a lot of us haven't found something that really clicks for us yet. But I also think there's a crisis of encouragement. And I think it takes a very small amount of encouragement. And interestingly enough, this is something that Peterson's talked about in some of his lectures, is that it takes a very small amount of encouragement for somebody to be completely brought out of the pits, And I think this is starting in schools. And I think it's starting at home, but it's also starting in schools. And I think we're more disconnected than ever. I think technology is such a great thing. Social media is such a great thing, but it can be so nefarious as well. And I don't know what we do about that. Maybe we can figure that out, or encourage people much smarter than myself to figure it out. But it's something I struggle with. It's something that kind of keeps me up at night, actually. I remember one specific instance of going to a school for a job fair for kids, like 5th and 6th graders. And there was this one kid who came and sat down, and I started asking him the list of questions. And I started asking him what he was interested in. And I just remember him looking at me so shocked. And I think it was something that kind of broke my heart a little bit, because I don't think that's an uncommon thing. I think there are a lot of us that have never been asked what we're interested in. I understand that small talk is an important thing, but I think we've done away with deep conversations because they're uncomfortable or they can be hard, in favor of small talk about the weather and sports and The Voice. And I think if we actually sat down and had real conversations with each other, whether in person, on YouTube, live streams, whatever, I think we'd be in a lot better place mentally. I hope there's some sort of good that can come out of things like this. I'm very hopeful for the future, because there's such an interest in personal development and podcasts and things like that. And I hope to keep doing this. I hope to continue to do this kind of stream of consciousness type thing, off the cuff. I don't want to do very much editing. Maybe I will do that in the future when I get a little bit better at it and actually learn how to do video editing. But for now, syncing video and audio is going to be enough of a challenge. But if one person happens to see this and finds benefit from it, great. And until next time, to anyone watching, hopefully you go out and read this book. Hopefully it helps you in some way, or at least is an interesting read. And I'll see you again next time. Thank you.